I have replayed that Sunday afternoon 10,000 times in my mind, and every time I reach the same moment, my grandson's small hand tugging at my sleeve, his voice barely a breath, his eyes too old for a 6-year-old's face. I feel the same ice that spread through my chest that day, slow and certain, the way frost moves across a window in the dead of winter. I have replayed it because I need to understand how I missed it, how I stood in my daughter's kitchen for 3 months, drinking tea her husband made for me, nodding at his explanations, and never once let myself ask the question I was already afraid to answer. My daughter's name is Claire. She is 34 years old, and she has her father's eyes, warm, brown, quick to laugh. She married Daniel 8 years ago in a garden ceremony outside the city, and I remember standing behind her while she adjusted her veil and thinking that I had never seen her look so certain about anything. Daniel was handsome, well-spoken, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and held doors open without being performative about it. My late husband Robert liked him. That mattered to me enormously. Robert had a nose for people. He used to say that a man who cannot look you in the eye while shaking your hand is a man who is already calculating how to use you. And Robert had looked Daniel in the eye and shaken his hand and said afterward, quietly, that he thought Claire had made a good choice. Robert died 4 years ago, a stroke, sudden and without warning, the kind of death that arrives like a sentence with no preamble. After that, Claire became more important to me, not in a clinging way, but in the way that remaining things become precious. She called me every day. She brought the children, Eli, who is 6, and Mia, who is 4, to my house every Sunday for lunch, and we had a ritual. I made pot roast, Eli set the table with great seriousness, and Mia arranged flowers from the garden in a jug that was far too large for the stems she picked. It was ordinary. It was everything. So when Daniel called me in early September and told me that Claire had been sent abroad for a work project, 3 months, possibly more, the company needed their best project manager on site. She would call when she could, but the time difference was difficult. I believed him. Not because it was impossible. Claire did travel for work sometimes, a week here, a conference there. But 3 months with barely a word? That was unusual. Still, I told myself that projects demanded full attention. I told myself that Claire was responsible, dedicated, perhaps embarrassed that she had to be away so long. I told myself a great many things, and each thing sounded reasonable on its own, and I stacked them neatly on top of each other and did not look at the structure I was building. The first month, I called her mobile regularly. Sometimes it rang through to voicemail. Sometimes Daniel answered it. He was holding it for her, he explained, so she wouldn't rack up international charges, and told me she was in a meeting, or sleeping because of the time difference, or in an area with poor signal. He was always calm, always slightly apologetic, as if the inconvenience of her absence was a weight he, too, was carrying. He brought the children to my house on Sundays, which I appreciated, and he drank my tea and asked how I was managing and said that Claire sent her love. I should have asked to see a text message. I should have asked for the name of the project, the country, the company office. I am 71 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that grief softens the edges of suspicion. And I was still, in the slow and private way of widows, grieving Robert, and that softness was something Daniel either understood or had simply noticed and decided to use. By the second month, I was uneasy in a way I couldn't name. The children seemed quieter, not sad exactly, but careful, the way children become careful when they are managing something they don't have the words for. Mia stopped arranging the flowers. She still came to Sunday lunch, still ate her pot roast, still climbed into my lap afterward to watch whatever program Eli chose, but there was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before. Eli, meanwhile, had developed a habit of watching Daniel with a particular attention, tracking him across a room the way you track something unpredictable. I noticed it and filed it under the general category of children adapting to a parent's absence, which is real and common and something I had read about. I was looking for explanations that would let me keep my stack of reasonable things standing. It was the third Sunday of October when everything changed. The children were at my kitchen table after lunch, drawing with the colored pencils I kept in a ceramic pot by the window, and Daniel had stepped outside to take a phone call. I was washing up, listening to the radio at low volume, and I heard Eli say to Mia, in the serious tone he used when he was explaining something important, "Put Mommy in the picture. She has to be in the picture." Mia said something I couldn't quite hear. Eli said, "She's still part of the family. She goes here." I turned around. They were drawing what appeared to be our family, stick figures in a row in front of a house, each carefully labeled in Eli's large, uneven printing. Robert was there, which made my throat tighten, labeled Grandpa in Heaven, with a small cloud above him. I was there. Daniel was there. Eli and Mia were there. But Claire, and I could see Eli was trying to place her, his pencil hovering, Claire's figure was drawn below the house, not beside it, not in the garden, below it, underground in the way children draw things that are underground, below a line of brown crayon that represented the earth. I set down the dish I was holding very carefully. I came to the table and crouched beside Eli, and I kept my voice as steady as I could. "Tell me about the picture, sweetheart," I said. Eli looked at me with those serious eyes and said, "That's where Mommy is. Dad hid Mom in a pit." The dish I had set down, I heard it as though from a distance, sliding from the edge of the counter where I had not, it turned out, placed it as carefully as I thought. Daniel came back inside 3 minutes later and found me on my knees on the kitchen floor, picking up the pieces. He helped me. He was kind about it. He said, "These things happen," offered to replace it, asked if I'd cut myself. I said no, I was fine. I was just clumsy, thank you. And I watched his face the entire time. This man with the good manners and the remembered coffee orders, this man my husband had shaken hands with, and I thought, I am not calling the police. Not yet. Because if I call the police and I am wrong, I lose everything. Daniel's cooperation, access to the children, any chance of finding out the truth before he has time to prepare for it. And if I call the police and I am right, and Daniel has even 20 minutes of warning, I might lose Claire. I had someone else to call, someone Daniel would not expect, someone he had, in the 8 years of his marriage to my daughter, worked very carefully to keep at a distance. I drove home that evening with the children's drawing folded in my coat pocket and my hands perfectly steady on the wheel, and I thought about what Robert would have said. He would have said, "Find the person your enemy fears and put them on the phone." That person was my brother Frank. Frank is 68 years old, and he is the kind of man who takes up space without trying. Not physically, he is not particularly large, but in the way a room adjusts when he enters it, the way conversations slow down and recalibrate, the way people who have known him for 30 years still choose their words carefully in his presence. He was a federal investigator for 26 years, the kind of work that is never fully explained at family dinners. And when he retired, he did not become soft or vague the way some men do when the structure of a career falls away. He became quieter, which, if you knew Frank, was more unsettling than noise. He had never liked Daniel. He had said so once, early on, before the wedding, in the direct and economical way Frank communicated things that mattered. There's something performed about him, like he's always aware of the audience. Claire had been hurt by that. I had smoothed it over, the way mothers smooth things over, and Frank had not repeated it, but he had watched. At Christmas dinners, at birthday lunches, at Eli's christening, where Daniel stood at the font with the practiced expression of a man demonstrating sincerity, Frank had watched and said nothing, and I had seen him watching and been grateful for his silence and faintly unsettled by what the watching implied. When I called him that Sunday evening, I did not give him the full story over the phone. I had learned, from 40 years of being Frank's sister, that he processed information better when he could see your face. "I need to see you," I said, "tomorrow morning." "It's about Claire." There was a pause. Not hesitation. Frank didn't hesitate. It was the pause of a man shifting his attention from one thing to another with complete deliberateness. And then he said, "I'll be at yours at 8. He arrived at 7:55 with 2 coffees from the place on the corner and the expression he wore when he already knew the broad shape of what he was about to hear. I put the children's drawing on the table between us without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at Eli's careful printing, at the brown crayon line of earth, at Claire's figure below it. Then he looked at me. "How long?" he said. 3 months, I said. "Daniel told me she was abroad for work, a project, international assignment." Frank picked up the drawing and held it at a slight angle, as though the light might reveal something additional. "Has anyone at her office confirmed this?" I had not thought to call her office. That is the thing about a well-constructed lie. It doesn't just tell you what to believe, it tells you what questions don't need asking. Claire's office, of course. "No," I said. Frank put the drawing down. He drank his coffee. "What's the name of her company?" "Hargrove Consulting. She's been there 6 years. "Do you have a contact there, someone she knew personally?" I thought of Claire mentioning, over many Sunday lunches, a colleague named Patricia, my work wife, Claire had called her once, laughing, who had been at Claire's baby shower for Mia, who had sent flowers when Robert died. I had her number because Claire had given it to me years ago for an emergency contact list that I kept in the drawer by the phone, the way women of my generation kept such lists, on paper, in a drawer, because we did not entirely trust the cloud with the things that mattered. I found it while Frank was still finishing his coffee. Patricia answered on the second ring, and her voice when I said my name was immediately, unmistakably, wrong. Too cautious, too careful, the voice of someone who had been waiting and dreading this particular call. "Mrs. Elaine," she said, and then stopped. "Patricia," I said, "I need to know if Claire is on an international assignment." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted. "Claire hasn't been in the office since September 4th, Patricia said finally. "We were told she took a personal leave of absence, indefinitely. HR got a letter, signed by her, but—" Another stop. "Elaine, I've been worried. I tried calling her mobile 3 weeks ago, and a man answered. He said she was unavailable and that I shouldn't call again. I thought maybe there was a family situation, that she needed space. But it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like Claire." I thanked Patricia. I kept my voice steady. I put the phone down and looked at Frank and said, "She never left. There was no assignment. Someone sent a letter to her office." Frank nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information that confirms rather than surprises. He was already pulling out his own phone. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "Don't contact Daniel today. Don't change your behavior toward him in any way. If he calls, answer normally. If he asks about the children, be normal. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "Good." He stood up, and there was something in the way he stood, the shift from brother having coffee to something older and more purposeful, that made the kitchen feel different. The air in it changed, as though a decision had been made that could not be unmade. "Elaine, I need you to think carefully. Is there anywhere on their property, on Daniel's property, that is not easily visible from the road or from neighboring houses? Outbuildings, a basement, a separate structure?" I thought about Claire and Daniel's house. A 4-bedroom colonial on Ardmore Lane, backing onto a half-acre of land that Daniel had always been particular about. He'd had it fenced the first year they moved in, a tall wooden privacy fence that he'd explained as noise reduction, and which everyone had accepted because the neighbors 2 doors down did have a dog that barked. There was a garden shed at the far end of the property, large, solid, the kind that came with the house rather than being assembled from a kit. Daniel kept it locked, which I had always attributed to tools and lawn equipment. Claire had mentioned once, offhandedly, that he kept the key on his person rather than on the household key rack, and she'd said it with the mild puzzlement of someone noting a minor quirk and deciding it wasn't worth raising. I had filed it in the same place I filed everything, under the category of men having their small domains, their private corners, their sheds full of things they considered theirs. I told Frank about the shed. I described the fence. I described the position of the property relative to the neighboring houses. Frank listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Good, that's useful. Now go home, make dinner, and wait for me to call you. Don't drive past the house. Don't call Daniel. Don't call anyone except me." He left, and I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, with the children's drawing on the table in front of me, looking at that small figure below the brown crayon earth. And I talked to Robert in the way I sometimes talked to him since he died. Not out loud, not quite, but in the interior voice that still reached for him in moments when I needed the particular steadiness he carried. I said, "I think she's in the shed. I think she's been there since September. I think the man you shook hands with has been feeding me explanations for 3 months while our daughter was 50 yards from her own children in a locked shed behind a privacy fence." And I said, I should have called Frank in September. I should have called Frank the first week. The thing about hindsight is that it is not actually useful as a form of self-punishment. It only becomes useful when you convert it into action. I had converted mine. Frank was making calls. The morning was still early. Daniel rang at 11:15. I answered on the third ring. Not too quickly, not too slowly. And he asked if the children had seemed all right on Sunday, whether Mia had eaten well, whether Eli had said anything about school. His voice was the voice I had known for 8 years. Warm, slightly tired in the way of single parents managing, grateful for my involvement. I said yes, they'd eaten well. Eli had mentioned a project about birds of prey. Mia had slept on the way home in the car. Daniel laughed softly and said he was glad they had me, that it made everything easier. I said I was glad to help. We said goodbye. I put the phone down and sat with my hands in my lap and breathed. Frank called at 2 p.m. His voice was different, still controlled. Frank's voice was always controlled. But underneath the control there was something taut, something that had been pulled tight and not yet released. I spoke to 2 people, he said. One is a former colleague, still active, who owes me a significant professional courtesy. The other is a woman named Barbara Crane. She is a family law attorney, and she is very good, and I have already told her about your situation. She is expecting your call this afternoon. He gave me the number. Elaine, what I am about to tell you, I need you to hear sitting down. I was already sitting down. I said so. The letter that was sent to Claire's office, Frank said. I had a contact run a quiet check through a connection at the postal system. Don't ask me how, it doesn't matter. The letter was sent from a UPS store on Clement Street, 11 days after Claire was last seen at her office. The signature on the letter, I got a copy of it. My contact has eyes on the HR file. The signature is not Claire's. I've seen Claire's signature on documents. This is a reasonable facsimile, but the pressure patterns are wrong, and the loop on the capital C doesn't match. Someone forged it. Someone who had seen her signature enough times to approximate it, but not enough to replicate it exactly. I held the phone and did not speak. There's more, Frank said. I had someone check with Daniel's employer. He works in commercial real estate, you know that. He hasn't been into his office regularly since mid-September either. He's been working remotely, which is permitted in his firm, but 3 colleagues independently noted that he seemed distracted, that he'd missed 2 client meetings without adequate explanation, that he had rearranged his schedule in ways that struck people as unusual. One colleague mentioned that Daniel had asked in late August about the process for having a spouse declared mentally incapacitated and gaining power of attorney on that basis. He'd framed it as a question about a client situation. The colleague remembered it because it had seemed like an odd question for a commercial real estate context. Power of attorney, mentally incapacitated. I heard the words and I felt the shape of the plan open up before me, the way a diagram becomes suddenly legible when you find the key. Daniel didn't want to harm Claire in the irreversible sense. He wanted her assets. He wanted the house, which was in Claire's name, purchased with money that had come partly from Robert's life insurance, partly from a trust Robert had set up for her specifically, not for the marriage, for Claire. He wanted the investment accounts. He wanted control of the financial structure that Claire had built over 6 careful years. And to get power of attorney, he needed her to be either incapacitated or compliant. And apparently he had decided that isolation and whatever else 3 months in a locked shed involved was his method of achieving one or the other. "Frank," I said, and my voice was someone else's voice, flat and strange and very quiet. "How do we get her out without giving him time to—" "Barbara Crane is expecting your call at 3 o'clock, Frank said. "Call her. Listen to what she tells you, then call me back. My colleague is moving carefully because if we do this wrong, it becomes inadmissible and Daniel walks away from everything except possibly a domestic charge that gets pled down to nothing. We do this right, and he doesn't walk anywhere. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I said. "Good. Call Barbara." I called Barbara Crane at 3 o'clock exactly, and within the first 4 minutes of that conversation, I understood why Frank had chosen her. She was precise, fast, and utterly without sentimentality, which was exactly what the situation required. She had dealt with cases of spousal confinement before. Not often, she said, but they existed, and they followed recognizable patterns, and the pattern I was describing was consistent with what she had seen. She told me what Frank's colleague would need in terms of evidence before approaching the property. She told me about the legal mechanisms for an emergency welfare check that would be harder for Daniel to intercept or preempt than a standard police call. She told me that the forged letter to Claire's office was a significant piece of the criminal picture, and that the power of attorney inquiry Daniel had made to his colleague could be documented and was relevant. She told me, at the end, in the same precise and unsentimental voice, "If your daughter is on that property, we will find her. And if she is, Daniel Marsh will not have a soft landing." I want to be honest with you about the timeline. This cannot happen tonight. It needs to be done correctly, which means tomorrow at the earliest, more likely the day after. I know that is difficult to hear. It was difficult to hear, but I heard it. And I thought of Eli's drawing, and Claire below the brown crayon earth. And I thought of 3 months of Sunday lunches where Daniel had sat across from me and been warm and slightly tired and grateful. And I knew that 2 more days, handled correctly, was better than 1 evening handled wrong. I made dinner that night. I ate it. I washed up. I did not drive past Ardmore Lane. I did not call Daniel. I sat in my armchair with Robert's photograph on the table beside me, and I talked to him again, interior and wordless. And this time, I didn't say I should have. I said, "I'm coming, Claire. Hold on 2 more days. I'm coming." The next 48 hours were the longest of my life, and I have lived through a husband's sudden death, a cancer scare that turned out to be nothing, and the particular suspended terror of waiting for a child's fever to break at 3 in the morning. I know what long hours feel like. But those 2 days had a quality that was different from grief or fear or even dread. They had the quality of something held very still under enormous pressure. The way you hold a cracked thing together with your hands and breathe shallowly because you know that one wrong movement will shatter it completely. Frank called me Monday evening to give me the structure of what was being arranged. His former colleague, he referred to him only as Ray, and I did not ask for a surname, had connections in the county sheriff's department that bypassed the standard dispatch system, which mattered because a standard welfare check called into a general line could, in theory, be monitored or anticipated by someone with the right contacts or simply the right amount of paranoia. Daniel, Frank had established, was precisely the kind of man who had spent 3 months thinking through contingencies. The approach needed to come from a direction Daniel wasn't watching. Ray was arranging for a welfare check to be conducted under a specific provision that allowed it to be initiated by a credentialed third party, in this case, Barbara Crane, acting on documented concern from a family member, rather than through a standard emergency call. It would be conducted by 2 sheriff's deputies, accompanied by a social worker and, critically, a locksmith. If the shed was locked, the locksmith would open it under the welfare provision. Daniel would have no legal basis to refuse entry to the property once the provision was properly invoked. And if he attempted to physically obstruct it, that obstruction would itself be a criminal act. The entire operation had the weight of procedure behind it, which was the only thing that would hold in court afterward. "What do I do?" I asked Frank. "You are not there," Frank said. "This is non-negotiable. You are not on the property, you are not on the street, you are not within visual range when this happens. If Daniel sees you, he will know the approach came from you, and there is a small but real possibility that in the time between seeing you and the deputies reaching the shed, he does something irreversible. I need you to be somewhere else, somewhere I can reach you, and I need you to stay there until I call." I understood the logic. I hated the logic with every part of myself that was a mother, and I understood it completely. "Where should I be?" I said. "Barbara's office," Frank said. "She has a waiting room. You sit in it. You have your phone. You wait." I told him I would. I asked him what time. He said Tuesday mid-morning between 10 and 11, when Daniel was most likely to be inside the house on work calls, based on the pattern Ray had observed over the previous 24 hours. I did not ask how Ray had observed a pattern in 24 hours. I did not want to know the specifics of how Frank's world operated when it shifted into this register. I trusted the outcome and let the method remain abstract. Tuesday morning, I dressed carefully, which is something I do when I am frightened. I choose clothes deliberately. I take time with each small decision because the attention required by ordinary things keeps the larger fear from filling all the available space. I wore the gray wool jacket that Claire had given me for my birthday 2 years ago. I thought she should see it on me when I saw her. I drove to Barbara Crane's office, which was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, all clean lines and pale wood, and the particular hush of spaces where serious things are decided quietly. Her assistant, a young man named Oliver, who had clearly been briefed, brought me tea without being asked and did not attempt conversation. I sat in the waiting room with my tea and my hands in my lap and the gray wool jacket, and I waited. At 10:47, my phone rang. It was Frank. "She's out," he said. I had been holding myself so still for so long that when those 2 words arrived, the stillness broke all at once, and I made a sound that I could not have described and that I will not try to. The sound of something that has been compressed beyond its capacity to hold, suddenly releasing. Oliver looked up from his desk and then looked respectfully away. I pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed. "Is she—" I started. "She's alive," Frank said, and his voice had something in it I had not heard in a very long time, since we were children and something had frightened him. Not fear exactly, but the aftermath of fear, the exhale of it. "She's been assessed by the paramedics on scene. She's dehydrated, she's lost weight, she has a laceration on her left forearm that needs proper treatment, and she is going to need time. But she is alive, and she is out, and she is asking for you and for the children." The shed. I had been right about the shed. It was large and solid and set at the far end of the property behind the tall fence, and the deputies and the locksmith had opened it in under 3 minutes, and inside they had found Claire, my Claire, with her father's eyes, in a space that Daniel had divided with a partition wall, the intersection fitted with a cot, a chemical toilet, a small heater, and a padlocked door. He had been bringing her food and water on a schedule. He had been bringing her, in the weeks before Frank and Barbara and Ray had assembled their approach, documents to sign. She had refused to sign them. He had told her, each time she refused, that the children were fine, that they missed her, that she would stay in the shed until she understood that cooperation was the only way back to her life. The documents were a full power of attorney transferring control of all her assets, the house, the investment accounts, a small commercial property she had inherited from Robert, to Daniel, along with a letter to her employer formalizing the leave of absence, and a separate document prepared by someone with enough legal knowledge to make it look procedurally sound, declaring that Claire was voluntarily relinquishing her interest in the marital home. He had not needed her to be declared legally incapacitated if he could get her signature. He had simply decided that 3 months of isolation and controlled deprivation would produce the signature he needed. He had, apparently, badly misjudged the person my daughter was. The deputies had found the documents in the shed. Claire had hidden them under the thin mattress of the cot, understanding even in her exhausted and frightened state that they were evidence and that evidence needed to be preserved. She had kept them dry and intact for weeks. That detail, when Frank told me it, hit me somewhere underneath my ribs and stayed there. She had known. She had known she was waiting for something, that someone would come, and she had kept the documents safe and waited. Daniel had been in the house when the deputies arrived. He had come to the door calmly, the way he did everything, performing the calm, wearing it like the good manners he had always worn, and asked what the issue was, and been told that a welfare check was being conducted on the property. He had said there was no one on the property except himself. He had been shown the legal provision under which the check was being conducted, and he had made the calculation, visibly, that obstruction was the worse option. He had let them in. He had stood in the garden and watched them cross toward the shed, and when the locksmith opened the outer door and the inner padlock, and Claire walked out into the gray October morning, Daniel had not run. He had stood perfectly still, and the calculation in his face had shifted from one thing to another. Not guilt, Frank said, not remorse, but the expression of a man realizing that the version of events he had been prepared to argue was no longer viable. He had been taken into custody at the property. He had asked, at the moment of the handcuffs, to make a phone call, and had been told he could do so at the station. Barbara Crane came out of her office when Oliver told her Frank had called, and she sat across from me in the waiting room and said, "The deputies have everything, the documents, the physical evidence from the shed, witness statements from the scene. The forged letter to her employer is a separate charge. My office has already been in contact with the DA's office. They had a brief filed with them yesterday, anticipating this outcome. He will be charged today. Unlawful imprisonment, forgery, coercion, and potentially additional charges, depending on what Claire is able to tell us about the full 3 months. He will not be granted bail easily, given the nature of the confinement and the evidence of premeditation. If he is granted bail at all, there will be conditions that keep him away from Claire, from the children, and from you." I asked when I could see Claire. "Now," Barbara said. "She's been taken to Mercy General, precautionary, for the dehydration and the laceration. Frank is there. I'll drive you." I stood up, and I smoothed the gray wool jacket, and I picked up my bag, and I walked out of Barbara Crane's waiting room on a Tuesday morning in October with the particular clarity that arrives on the other side of the worst thing. Not happiness, not relief, not yet, but something cleaner and colder and more fundamental, the clarity of someone who has been in the dark and can now see the door. The drive to Mercy General took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on Barbara's dashboard the entire way. I did not speak. Barbara did not try to make me. She drove efficiently and without detours, and when she pulled up at the hospital entrance, she said only, "Second floor, room 14. Frank is in the corridor." I thanked her. I got out of the car. Frank was in the corridor exactly where Barbara had said. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his expression in the particular state of resolved attention that was his version of visible emotion. Contained but present, the way a banked fire is still fire. When he saw me, he said nothing. He simply stepped aside from the door to room 14 and put his hand briefly on my shoulder as I passed him. And that was enough. That was Frank. That was everything that needed to be said between us. I opened the door. Claire was sitting up in the hospital bed, an IV line in her left arm, her hair longer than I remembered, her face thinner, a white bandage on her left forearm. She was wearing a hospital gown, and the thin cotton blanket had been pulled up to her waist. When she saw me, her face changed. Not dramatically, not with the heaving theatrical release of film reunions, but with the particular exhausted, bottomless relief of someone who has been holding themselves together by pure will for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. "Mom," she said very quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my arms around her, carefully, the way you hold something that has been damaged and is also still strong. She did not cry immediately. She put her forehead against my shoulder and breathed. I held the back of her head with one hand, the way I had held it when she was an infant, when she was a child with a fever, when she was a teenager who had come home heartbroken and found that some things still required just this, the specific, wordless language of a mother's hands. "The children," she said after a long moment. "They're safe," I said. "They're at school. They're coming to mine this afternoon. They don't know yet. They know something has changed, but they don't know the details." "They drew me," Claire said. "Didn't they? Below the ground." I pulled back and looked at her. "Yes," I said. "Eli drew you below the ground. He told me." I paused. "That's how we found you." Claire closed her eyes. "He kept telling them I was away. He told them I'd gone somewhere and couldn't come back yet. But Eli—" She stopped. "Eli is 6. He understood more than Daniel realized. Children always do." "Always," I agreed. She opened her eyes, and in them I saw the thing I had been most afraid of not seeing. Not just survival, but the self still intact behind the survival. Claire's eyes, Robert's eyes, warm and brown and quick, still present, still hers, not extinguished by 3 months in a shed at the end of a garden. Diminished, yes. Frightened, yes. But present. The self still there, holding on, having kept the documents under the mattress, and waited. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Of course," I said. Outside, in the corridor, I could hear Frank's voice on his phone. Low, methodical. The voice of a man closing the remaining pieces of something. Through the window, the October sky was the particular pale gray of mornings that are cold, but not yet cruel. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Marsh was sitting in a police interview room, preparing to explain himself. And the documents were in evidence bags, and Barbara Crane's office was already filing, and the shape of the reckoning was assembled and in motion, and nothing he said in that room was going to stop it. I held my daughter's hand and let that be enough for right now. The children came to me that afternoon. Daniel's sister, a woman named Karen who lived 40 minutes outside the city and whom I had met perhaps 6 times over 8 years. A quiet, watchful woman who had always seemed vaguely uncomfortable around her brother, without my ever having pressed on why, had collected Eli and Mia from school at the standard time, not knowing yet the full shape of what had happened, knowing only that Frank had called her that morning and told her, in the way Frank told people things, that she needed to pick up the children today and bring them to me, and that he would explain everything later. She had done it without asking questions. I had noted that. People who know someone well enough to obey them without questions in a crisis, that is a particular kind of trust, earned over years. Karen brought them to my door at 3:30. Mia came in first at a run, the way she always did, straight to the kitchen because the kitchen was where the good things lived. The biscuit tin, the fruit bowl, the jug she always filled with flowers. Eli came in behind her more slowly, and he looked at my face the way he had been looking at Daniel's face for months, the watchful tracking of something he didn't yet have language for. I crouched down to his level in the hallway, and I looked at him directly, and I said, "Eli, I found Mummy." The expression that moved across his face was not the explosion of relief I might have expected. It was something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a child who has been carrying a secret weight for so long that the removal of it takes a moment to register. The way a muscle held in tension for hours needs time to understand that it is allowed to release. His lower lip moved once. Then he said, "I knew you would. I told Mia you'd find her." And then he put his arms around my neck and held on with the fierce, wordless grip of a 6-year-old who has been very frightened for a very long time and is only now allowing himself to feel it. I held him in the hallway for as long as he needed. Mia came back from the kitchen with a biscuit and found us there and climbed into the pile without entirely understanding why, which was exactly right, which was the particular grace of 4-year-olds who bring themselves to comfort without needing to understand its cause. I held both of them and I thought, whatever comes next, this moment is real. This is the ground. Everything else is built from here. I told them that evening, in the careful and simplified language you use with children when the truth is large and the children are small, that their mummy had been sick and in a place where she couldn't call them, but that she was getting better now and that they would see her very soon. Eli listened with the focused attention he brought to everything important. Mia asked if Mummy had a bandage. I said yes, a small one, on her arm. Mia said she would draw Mummy a picture of a flower to put next to the bandage to make it better. I said that was an excellent idea. She went to get the colored pencils. Eli waited until she was gone, then looked at me and said, quietly, "Is Dad coming back?" I held his gaze. "Not for a while," I said, which was as honest as I could be without being more than he was ready for. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already half known, and then he went to help Mia find the right shade of pink for her flower. Karen stayed for dinner. She sat at my kitchen table and I fed her pot roast, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I want you to know I didn't know. I want you to know that there were things I felt over the years, things that didn't sit right, but I didn't know." Her voice was steady, but her hands around her wineglass were not quite. "He's my brother," she said, "and I love him, I suppose, in the way you love people you've known your whole life. But I want you to understand that what he is and what he did, that is not something I will defend, not to you, not to anyone." I looked at her across the table and I thought of Frank saying, "There's something performed about him." And I thought of all the people in Daniel's life who had registered the wrongness and filed it away and not spoken. And I thought that Karen had done the same, and that she was sitting in my kitchen now eating pot roast and telling me she wouldn't defend him, and that this was not enough and was also something. "Thank you for getting the children today," I said. "That mattered." She nodded. She stayed until the children were in bed, and then she drove the 40 minutes home, and I sat in my armchair in the quiet and thought about the days ahead. Claire was discharged from Mercy General on Thursday. Frank drove her. I had prepared the small bedroom at the back of my house, the one with the window that looked onto the garden, the one that got the morning light, and I had put fresh flowers in a vase on the windowsill, not the big dramatic blooms you bring to hospitals, but small garden things, the last of the autumn salvias and some sprigs of rosemary, because the smell of rosemary was something Claire had loved since childhood, and I wanted the first room she slept in outside that shed to smell of something she had always loved. She came through my front door and stood in the hallway and looked around at the ordinary, familiar things, the coat rack, the telephone table, Robert's photograph, the ceramic pot of pencils, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way someone breathes when they are relearning what normal air feels like. Then Eli appeared at the top of the stairs and said, "Mummy," in a voice that contained everything. And Claire went up the stairs faster than someone 3 days out of a hospital should have moved, and I stood in the hallway below and listened to the sounds from the landing above and did not go up. Some reunions need to close the door. Mia's flower drawing was taped to the wall beside Claire's bed before the end of the day. I saw it there the following morning and could not speak for a moment. The legal machinery had been moving while all of this was happening, with the efficiency that Barbara Crane brought to everything. Daniel had been charged on the Wednesday, unlawful imprisonment, which in our state carried a sentence of up to 15 years, forgery of a legal document, coercion, and a further charge relating to the fraudulent letter sent to Claire's employer, which constituted identity fraud. His attorney, a man named Gerson, whose reputation Barbara had assessed in 2 words, competent but overmatched, had attempted to argue that the confinement had been consensual, that Claire had agreed to a period of voluntary isolation for mental health reasons, that the documents she had been asked to sign were simply estate planning instruments that she had misunderstood. The deputy's body camera footage from the morning of the welfare check showed the state of the shed, the padlock, the partition wall, the chemical toilet, the stripped-back conditions of the inner room. It showed Claire walking out into the daylight, shielding her eyes, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been in a confined space for a very long time. It showed Daniel, standing at the far end of the garden, watching, his face performing the calm that no longer meant anything now that the performance had been fully exposed. The bail hearing was the Friday of that first week. Barbara had filed a detailed brief on the risk of flight and the risk to the victim, including a document analysis of the forged letter prepared by a forensic handwriting examiner Frank had engaged, whose report concluded with a professional certainty that the signature was not Claire's. The judge set bail at a figure that Daniel's assets, assessed by the court, could technically meet, but Barbara had anticipated this and had filed a motion restricting Daniel's access to those assets pending the outcome of the fraud charges, on the basis that the assets were the subject of the alleged coercion. The motion was granted. Daniel's accounts were frozen. He could not make bail. He was remanded. When Barbara called to tell me, I was standing in my kitchen making tea, the ordinary, specific act of filling a kettle and setting it to boil, and I put the phone down and stood very still for a moment, and then I finished making the tea. Claire was in the garden with the children. Through the kitchen window, I could see her sitting on the garden bench with Mia on her lap and Eli beside her, pointing at something in the flower bed. A beetle, probably. Eli had been interested in beetles since the summer. Claire's face was turned toward whatever Eli was showing her, and even at this distance, through the glass, I could see the quality of her attention. Present, real, the practiced focus of a mother engaged with her child rather than the performance of it that I had watched Daniel deliver for years. The days settled into a shape. Not a happy shape, not yet. Happiness was somewhere further along, on the other side of court dates and testimony, and the long particular work of children processing a thing that was too large for them and too real to be made small. But a functioning shape. Claire slept in the morning light bedroom and ate meals at my kitchen table, and slowly, in the way of someone methodically reclaiming territory, reoccupied the ordinary details of a daily life, choosing what to eat for breakfast, deciding when to shower, picking up the phone and calling Patricia at Hargrove Consulting to say she was alive and coming back. Patricia, Claire told me afterward, had cried for 4 solid minutes before she could speak. Claire had let her cry and then said, "I kept the documents, Pat. I kept all of them." Patricia had said, "Of course you did. That's so you. That's so completely you." It was completely her. The first weekend, I took the children to a farm park 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with apple pressing and pumpkin picking, and a corn maze that Eli navigated with the focused intensity of a small general, consulting the map they gave you at the entrance and refusing to accept help. Claire came, but did not push herself, sat on a bale of hay near the entrance to the maze, and watched them with the particular expression of someone relearning what it feels like to watch your children simply be children, without the filter of fear or absence. I sat beside her and did not fill the silence. The silence was comfortable, companionable, the silence of 2 people who know each other well enough that presence alone is a form of conversation. "I thought about Dad a lot," Claire said after a while, in there. "I thought about what he would have done, what he would have said." "What would he have said?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. A crow landed near the hay bale and regarded us with the rude curiosity of crows, and then took off again. "He would have said that the only thing that mattered now was what I did next," Claire said. "He was always very oriented toward next. He didn't like dwelling." "No," I said, "he didn't." "He would have liked that Eli drew the picture," she said. "He would have said, 'That's a good boy, that one. He sees things.'" "He does," I said. "He always has." Claire looked at me then, with Robert's eyes, and said, "Thank you for not calling the police first. I know that seems strange, but if Daniel had had any warning at all, he would have had a plan. He always had a plan. He would have made it look like something else. You know that, don't you?" "I know," I said. "Frank was the right call," she said. "You knew that." "Your father told me," I said, in a manner of speaking. She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked back at the corn maze, where Eli had just emerged triumphant from the exit, holding the map aloft, shouting for us to look. We looked. We applauded. Mia came tumbling out behind him and immediately fell over a pumpkin and laughed at herself, the full-body laugh of small children for whom falling is still funny rather than painful. Claire watched her daughter laughing in a pumpkin patch on an October afternoon, and I watched Claire, and somewhere in the structure of that moment there was the beginning of something. Not recovery exactly, not yet, but the precondition of it, the ground being prepared, the first light before actual warmth. On the drive home, Eli fell asleep in his car seat, with the corn maze map still clutched in one hand. Mia held her pumpkin on her lap and talked to it quietly, names she was deciding between. She settled on Gerald, which she announced with great authority as we pulled into my street. Claire sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the evening coming in over the rooftops and said nothing. And I drove, and the radio played something low and unhurried, and for 11 minutes on the way back from a farm park in October, everything was simply this: my daughter beside me, my grandchildren in the back, the ordinary road. The pretrial hearings began in November. Barbara was methodical and relentless, which was exactly what the situation required. The forensic analysis of the shed had produced evidence that the inner room had been modified: the partition wall, the ventilation, the padlocking mechanism on the inner door, in the weeks before Claire's disappearance, which meant that Daniel had planned the confinement in advance, which elevated the charge from a crime of impulse to one of premeditation. Premeditation changed the sentencing range significantly. Barbara had also located, through a process she described simply as thorough financial forensics, evidence that Daniel had consulted a private legal document service, not a licensed attorney, a cut-rate online service used for estate planning, in late July, 2 months before Claire disappeared, and had used Claire's identifying information to draft the power of attorney document she had later been asked to sign. That consultation was on record. It had a timestamp. It was 2 months before September 4th. The picture it assembled was complete and damning, and not susceptible to the argument of impulse or misunderstanding. A man who had spent the summer methodically planning the legal and physical infrastructure of his wife's confinement, who had built a partition wall in a shed, who had forged a letter to her employer, who had told his mother-in-law and his children and his colleagues a coherent and rehearsed story, who had brought Claire food and water and documents to sign on a schedule for 3 months, waiting for her to break, who had not reckoned, in all his careful planning, on a 6-year-old boy who knew that his mother was not away for work, who knew that something was wrong and below the ground, who had the instinct to tell his grandmother in the only language he had available, a crayon drawing on a Sunday afternoon at a kitchen table with colored pencils in a ceramic pot by the window. The thing Daniel had not planned for was Eli. He had underestimated a 6-year-old, which was, in the end, the crack in the entire architecture of his plan. Children always understand more than the adults managing them expect. Daniel had spent months managing his children's understanding, feeding them an explanation, monitoring their responses, calibrating the story. And Eli had absorbed the story and simultaneously kept, separate and private, the thing he actually knew. He had waited until he was somewhere safe: my kitchen, Sunday lunch, the ordinary ritual of pot roast and flower arrangements. And then he had told it in the only form available to him, because he did not yet have the words, but he had the crayons, and he had the paper, and he had, apparently, inherited enough of his grandfather's orientation toward truth to know that the drawing needed to be accurate. I thought about that often in those November weeks, between court dates and school runs and the slow work of Claire's restoration. I thought about what it meant that the instrument of Daniel's undoing was a 6-year-old with a box of colored pencils. There was something in it, not justice exactly, too neat a word, but something that felt like the right shape of things, something that felt like the world correcting itself through the smallest and most honest available means. Daniel Marsh was convicted the following March: unlawful imprisonment, forgery, coercion, identity fraud. The judge noted the duration of the confinement, the evidence of premeditation, and the presence of 2 minor children in the household throughout. She sentenced him to 11 years. His attorney had nothing left to argue. Daniel sat at the defense table and performed the calm one final time, and then the bailiff came, and the performance ended, and he was taken away. Barbara Crane called me from the courthouse steps. "It's done," she said. Claire had given her victim impact statement 2 weeks earlier. She had read it quietly, without theatrics, looking at the page rather than at Daniel, and when she finished, she gathered the pages together with the same neat deliberateness she had used to keep the documents under the mattress in that shed, and she walked out. I had watched Daniel's face during her statement. The performance slipped once. Not remorse, I don't think he was capable of it, but the recognition that the version of Claire he had built his plan around had never actually existed. He had expected her to break. She had kept the documents and waited. 8 years of marriage, and he had never truly known her. The house on Ardmore Lane was sold as part of the asset recovery. Claire didn't want to return to it, which required no discussion. Her accounts were restored, the power of attorney documents legally voided, the commercial property Robert had left her remained hers. Daniel had failed entirely to reach the one thing he had planned for. Barbara's final invoice was substantial. Claire paid it the same day and sent a handwritten note. By spring, Claire had moved into a terraced house 12 minutes from mine. Small garden, old boiler, kitchen taps that needed replacing. She stood in the doorway on the day she got the keys and said, "Perfect." She meant it entirely. Imperfect and hers was exactly right. Frank came for the first Sunday lunch at Claire's new house in April. She made pot roast. Eli set the table with his customary seriousness. Mia arranged flowers from the garden in a jug that was, as always, far too large for the stems she picked. Frank ate without ceremony and said it was good, which from Frank was the equivalent of a standing ovation. After lunch, Eli showed him the corn maze map, mounted on his bedroom wall. Frank studied it with genuine attention and told Eli it was excellent navigational work. Eli accepted this with appropriate gravity. I had brought the children's drawing with me, the original, the one made at my kitchen table in October, the one I had carried in my coat pocket the night I drove home and called Frank. I had kept it in the drawer by the phone, next to Patricia's number, next to the ordinary essential things. I gave it to Claire after lunch, while the children were in the garden and Frank was washing up quietly without being asked. Claire looked at it for a long moment, at Eli's printing, at the row of stick figures, at the brown crayon line of earth, at the small figure below it that a 6-year-old had placed there because he knew the truth and he had the pencils and he drew what he knew. She folded it carefully and put it in her own kitchen drawer and closed it. For the record, she said, he was always the smartest one in the room. Outside, Eli was explaining beetle taxonomy to Mia, who was tolerating it with the patience of a younger sibling enduring unsolicited expertise. The afternoon light was the soft gold of late spring, the kind that makes ordinary things look like they were always meant to be exactly as they are. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and pot roast, and the faint green of the garden coming through the open door. Some things, once broken, do not return to their original shape. They return to a different one, marked by what happened, reinforced in unexpected places. We had lost the easy assumption that ordinary life is solid ground, the unexamined trust that the people closest to you are who they appear to be. That would not come back. But everything Daniel had tried to take was still here. The house, the Sunday lunches, the children, the ceramic pot of pencils, the jug too large for its flowers. And Eli, who had looked at a crayon drawing and told the truth in the only language available to him, and that had been enough. That had been everything. Robert would have said, "That's a good boy, that one. He sees things." He does. He always will.